Good evening, добрий вечір. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and join the community in American and Ukrainian anthem singing.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Ще не вмерла Україна, ні слава, ні воля. Ще нам, браття українці, усміхнеться доля. Згинуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці. Запануєм і ми, браття, у своїй сторонці. Душу тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду. Душу тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду.
Please remain standing as the children procession comes through. Please light your candles from the children. We are getting ready for the Litia. I would like to welcome Fathers Petro, Evgen, and Roman to the front. Choir members, please come forward. And Litia is a form of short Byzantine worship which is used for asking for victory, withdrawal of natural disasters, and commemoration of deceased.
Благословен Бог наш завжди, нині повсякчас і на віки вічні.
Святий Боже, святий кріпкий, святий безсмертний, помилуй нас. Святий Боже, святий кріпкий, святий безсмертний, помилуй нас. Святий Боже, святий кріпкий, святий безсмертний, помилуй нас.
Слава Отцю і Сину і Святому Духові, і нині повсякчас і на віки вічні. Амінь. Пресвята Троїця, помилуй нас, Господи, очисти гріхи наші, Владико, прости беззаконня наші, святий, зглянься, зціли немочі наші, імени Твого ради. Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй. Слава Отцю і Сину і Святому Духові, і нині повсякчас і на віки вічні. Амінь. Отче наш, що єси на небесах, нехай святиться ім'я Твоє, нехай прийде царство Твоє, нехай буде воля Твоя, як на небі, так і на землі. Хліба нашого щоденного дай нам сьогодні, і прости нам провини наші, які ми прощаємо винуватцям нашим, і не веди нас у спокусу, але визволи нас від лукавого.
Бо Твоє царство і сила, і слава Отця, і Сина, і Святого Духа, нині повсякчас, і на віки вічні.
Духом спочили праведний, душу раби Твоїх слав, все упокой, і прийми їх до блаженного життя з Тобою, чоловіколюбче. Оселя Твої, Господи, де всі святі Твої спочивають. Упокой душу рабів Твоїх, бо Ти не чоловіколюбець. Слава Отцю і Синові, і Святому Духові, Ти єси Бог, що до пекла зійшов, Ти розвив кайдани закованих. Самі душі рабів Твоїх упокой, і нині, і повсякчас, і на віки вічні. Амінь. Єдина чиста і непорочна від Діва, що Бога безсмертно породила, моли за спасіння душі.
Помилуй нас, Боже, з великої ласки Твоєї, молимо ж Тобі, вислухай і помилуй.
Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй.
Ще молимо за спокій душу спочилих Божих, жертв Голодомору, і за відпущення всякої провини вільної і невільної.
Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй.
Господь помилуй душу, де праведні спочивають.
Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй.
Милости Божої Царства Небесного і відпущення Рі Божого Христа безсмертного Царя Бога нашого, просимо. Господи, помолимо.
Господи, помилуй.
Бо Ти єси воскресіння, життя і спокій, спочи рабів Твоїх, всіх жертв Голодомору, Христе Боже наш, імена сам найкраще всі знаєш, і Тобі ми славу віддаємо з предвічним Твоїм Отцем, і Пресвятим, і милосердним, і животворчим Твоїм Духом, нині повсякчас і на віки вічні.
Премудрість Пресвята Богородице, спаси нас.
Чеснішу від херовимів, незрівняно славнішу від серафимів, що без істиння Богослова породила, дійсну Богородицю Тебе величаємо.
Слава Тобі, Христе Боже, надія наша, слава Тобі.
Слава Отцю і Синові, і Святому Духові, і нині, і повсякчас, і на віки вічні. Амінь. Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй. Отче, благослови.
Христос, що володіє живими і мертвими, істинний Бог наш, молитва пречистої своїй матері, святославних схваль апостолів, преподобне поносностів наших всіх святих, душу від нас почилих жертв Голодомору 32-33 років, в оселях святих оселить у лоні Авраам покой до правди приєднає, і нас помилує милосердний, і чоловіколюбець.
У блаженному спенні вічного покіпа наш Господи, особшим рабам Твоїм, які загинули під час Голодомору, і сотворим вічною пам'ять.
Today, we are here to remember Holodomor through our stories. We are here because we vowed to never forget about what happened in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933. I would like to welcome on the stage the chair of the Twin Cities Holodomor Commemoration Committee, Zina Polec-Utmanis, who will share with you a few remarks about today's event.
Шановні отці, пані і панове, українська громада, and welcome guests. 85 years ago, the towns and villages in the grasslands of central and eastern Ukraine were filled with the dead and dying. Every day, people collapsed and died of hunger right in the street. It was an agonizing death, as a person's body consumed itself and the organs shut down. People were literally driven insane from it. At the height of the famine in June 1933, 28,000 Ukrainian villagers were dying of starvation each day. Their deaths were due to a genocide devised by the Soviet regime under Stalin to speed up the collectivization of agriculture. In simple terms, the Communist Party wanted Ukrainian farmers to give up all the land their families had owned for generations, their farm equipment, and their animals, and then work on those same farms, now owned by the government as paid workers. Because the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, Ukrainians were also required to become atheists, stop speaking Ukrainian, and give up all of their national traditions. Ukrainian farmers strongly resisted these outrageous demands. So to break their spirit, in 1932, the Soviet authorities ordered the collective farms to deliver impossibly high quotas of grain. When the farmers failed to deliver, communist agents went door to door and took all the food away from the people. Everything. Then they closed off the land and waited for everyone to die. This forced famine was coupled with an attack on the intellectual, religious, and political leadership of Ukraine as well. So you may be wondering why I'm up here talking about this. I'm not a historian, I'm a communicator. 3 years ago, I was invited to join a national committee to help out with public relations for the unveiling of the Holodomor Memorial in Washington, D.C. I remained on that committee to help with the 85th anniversary, which included planning this local commemoration. So I've spent 3 years thinking and observing and paying attention to how people talk about the Holodomor, which means murder by starvation in Ukrainian. In the last year or so, due to Anne Applebaum's bestseller, Red Harvest, and the movie Bitter Harvest, the American public at large is probably better educated about the Holodomor than ever before. But what are we as Ukrainians saying? And what are we not saying? And what could we be saying? One topic that always comes up when Ukrainian Americans talk about the Holodomor is Walter Duranty. He was a New York Times journalist who won a Pulitzer Prize for his extremely false coverage of the good times in Ukraine and the Soviet Union while a genocide was taking place. Several times over the past 30 years, Ukrainians have come together to get his Pulitzer Prize revoked, so far unsuccessfully. I understand that impetus to punish someone. Ukraine wasn't like Rwanda with its Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It wasn't like Nazi Germany where the Americans came in and held the Nuremberg trials. Instead, when the famine ended, all the communist officials who caused it remained in power. The Ukrainian victims were strictly forbidden from talking or writing about the Holodomor at all. Instead of healing, there was ongoing terror. This continued for 50 years, and in Russia, many still deny the Holodomor ever took place. It's probably too late to uncover all the facts about the real perpetrators. Key records were destroyed or remain locked away in the Kremlin. All those perpetrators are now dead. They got away with it. So I understand that drive for justice, to hold someone accountable, even Walter Duranty. Another thing that people have a strong opinion on is the number of millions who died. This is very controversial. My opinion is that unless you are an academic or doing original research, we really don't know. On the lower side, recent research shows that at least 4.9 million people were deliberately starved to death. That's about the population of Minnesota. On the higher side, 10 million people were killed. That's about the population of Sweden. Wipe out every single Minnesotan or every Swede. Either way, it's an unspeakable tragedy. The other reason I don't like to focus on numbers in communicating with the public is that it tends to set up a competitive dynamic with other populations that have experienced genocide, like whose genocide is worse. Post-genocidal societies should be allies. We can learn from each other and help heal each other. One more theme I've heard among Ukrainian Americans quite a bit is, don't waste your resources talking about the Holodomor to us. We know all about it. Tell it to the American public. Teach it in the schools. Talk to them. Educate them. And I agree that the public at large needs to know more about the Holodomor and that it's valuable to teach it. What I don't agree with is that our community knows all about it. We may know the facts, but what I've noticed is missing in our conversations is an emotional connection. Across the United States, one thing that Ukrainian communities have not been talking about is our personal connections to the Holodomor, its victims, and its survivors. Let me go back in time to the 1980s, when two scholars at Harvard University, Robert Conquest and his teaching assistant, James Mace, were conducting research on the Ukraine famine of 1932-33. Since the Soviet Union denied it, there were limited records for them to study. So they began interviewing Holodomor survivors who were living in the US. They recorded each person telling their own individual story. Collectively, the power of those stories, also called oral histories, painted a picture of widespread suffering that broke through into the world's consciousness. Dr. Mace brought the oral histories of Ukrainian survivors as testimony to the U.S. Congressional Commission on the Ukraine famine. Based on those eyewitness testimonies, Congress concluded that the Soviet regime had committed and covered up a genocide. Oral history. I'm going to share an oral history now, my own. I grew up here in Minneapolis, a typical Ukrainian diaspora kid. I learned some Ukrainian history at our Vidna Shkola Saturday school, but the first time I remember hearing about the Holodomor was in 1983 when we held a 50th anniversary commemoration event. It was enormous. Dr. Mace himself came and spoke at the University of Minnesota West Bank Auditorium. I remember there was an outdoor requiem between St. Michael's and St. Constantine's, and all of the youth group kids were dressed up in our uniforms, and we marched, and it was very sad and sobering. And that was pretty much the extent of my involvement until I joined the National Holodomor Committee, which is how I happened to be sitting at my parents' kitchen table talking to my mother about the work I was doing and how great it was that we had identified a survivor in the Maryland suburbs. And I was saying, the survivor this, the survivor that. And she kind of looked at me and she was like, you do know that your grandparents lived through the Holodomor. And I was dumbfounded. You know, I should have known. They lived in the Kharkiv region, which was devastated. But my grandmother, Yevdokia Sokoyska, and I had been very close. I was her first grandchild. You know, we used to hang out at her house all the time when I was a kid, and when I was in high school, she moved in with us. But she had never talked about her experiences with the famine, and I had never known to ask. My mother told me a story about how my grandmother at that time was living with her parents, and during the famine, people would come to the gate of her house every day asking for something, anything. Sometimes they would die there at the gate. One day a woman came by holding a naked, swollen baby, and my grandmother ran into the house to find a rag or an old shirt to cover and wrap that baby. I think about what it must have been like for her then. A young woman, just about 20 years old. My grandmother was a very giving person. Her dream in life was to be a nurse. I can't imagine how devastating it was for her to encounter all of these people in great need and be unable to help them because she had absolutely nothing herself to give them. This is the first time I'm telling my Bible story publicly, and it's kind of emotional for me. I really loved her, and knowing this about her fills me with even greater compassion that she kept this traumatic experience to herself. Even though she didn't talk about it, though, it was there. But why don't we talk about it? I would like to encourage our community to start thinking differently about the Holodomor. Not just something to teach about others out there, but sharing our personal stories and thinking about what's in here and having compassionate conversations with each other to better understand ourselves as a post-genocide people and how that has transformed our families and our Ukrainian American community. I'm going to finish my remarks with 2 reasons why I believe we should approach the Holodomor from a more personal angle, this oral history angle. The first reason is external. Although I hate to give Stalin credit for anything, he did make a very profound, if psychopathic, point. He said, when one person is murdered, it's a tragedy. When 1 million people are murdered, it's a statistic. We just have to look at current events to know how true that is. Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen harbor now for 3 years. 10 million people in Yemen are at risk of death by starvation. It's the worst humanitarian catastrophe right now in the world. The Saudis used American weapons to bomb buses, school buses filled with Yemeni children. And in the face of all of this overwhelming information and statistics, there's no Walter Duranty here, the world isn't really paying attention. But then one person, that journalist Jamal Khashoggi, is murdered horrifically, and it became a really big deal. Humans are wired so that the story of one person's suffering has much more impact than the suffering of nameless millions. I know I said earlier that we shouldn't compare genocides, but Holocaust survivors have been telling their personal stories for a long time, and that has really resonated with the world. Yet in the Twin Cities Ukrainian community, I never once heard or had a conversation about the personal or family Holodomor experiences of the people around me until I started working on today's event. I don't know if any of my Ukrainian friends have lost family members, but I do know the Holocaust story of Jared Kushner, his grandparents. The second reason to start sharing our stories is internal. We draw power from knowing who we are. Totalitarian regimes all over the world have the same playbook, and they know this. And it's why their governments try to destroy peoples that won't assimilate and fall in line. We see what China is doing in Tibet. They're persecuting their religious leaders, moving in outsiders to populate the territory of Tibet, banning the Tibetan religion, and trying to wipe out their customs. Sound familiar? When people forget who they are, they become easy to manipulate. When we own our history, we plug back into that power of our Ukrainian ancestors. So today, let us pray for and remember the millions of Ukrainians who died of starvation 85 years ago. Let us pray for and remember family members, including so many children who died in the Holodomor. Let us pray for and remember our own Twin Cities community members who survived both the famine and World War II, and then spent their later years constructively as Ukrainian patriots and American citizens. Let us also pray for the good health of our remaining living Holodomor survivors here in the Twin Cities. Pani Kira Tserahradska, Pani Olga Kovalevska, Pani Leonila Pachkovska, and maybe others I don't know of. Our program's theme today is Our History, Our Stories. Through oral history, we hope to bring you some fresh perspectives on the Holodomor and shed new light on how it traumatized our ancestors and continues to affect us here and now. Thank you.
Thank you, Zina. Ukrainians all over the world are working hard on having Holodomor be recognized as a genocide against Ukrainian nation worldwide. It takes small steps like one we have taken in our community to bring a great results. Now, I'd like to welcome to the stage Volodymyr Anastasievsky, who will read a letter from Consul General in Chicago and proclamations from the Governor of Minnesota and the Mayor of the city of St. Paul.
Генеральне консульство України в Chicago, Consulate General of Ukraine in Chicago. Dear Ukrainian diaspora, honorable guests, dear friends of Ukraine, Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide famine, is one of the most tragic events in the history of Ukraine. This man-made famine genocide in Ukraine was imposed by the communist regime in 1932 and 33 to execute Joseph Stalin's dreadful master plan of snuffing out the resistance of patriotic Ukrainians who refused to be subject to communist rule and the collectivization of privately owned farms. As a result, Stalin orchestrated the death by starvation of more than 7 million men, women, and children. Our mission for the commemoration of the 85th anniversary of the Holodomor is to honor the innocent victims while sharing their story. The emphasis on this commemorative year for the Ukrainian nation is to observe the historical tragedy by appropriate means, not just within the borders of Ukraine, but throughout the world. Thanks to an active Ukrainian diaspora in the state of Minnesota that has made an incredible contribution to reaching out to the American community to pay tribute to the memory of the millions of innocent victims and honor the survivors whose stories enlighten. The Governor of Minnesota, Mark Dayton, and the Mayor of St. Paul, Melvin Carter, proclaimed this day, October 28, 2018, the Ukrainian Holodomor Genocide Remembrance Day. We must not live in denial and work towards the eradication of genocides of all peoples. We have an obligation to lead in the pursuit of peace, justice, and freedom. The loss of millions of lives in the Holodomor Ukrainian genocide famine must not be in vain. May their memories be eternal. Wieczna im pamięć. Consul General Larissa Harasko. State of Minnesota, proclamation. Whereas, between 1932 and 1933, 7 to 10 million residents of Ukraine perished as a result of genocide by famine artificially created by the Stalinist Soviet government. And whereas, in 2018, Ukrainians around the world are observing the 85th anniversary of the genocide, now known as Holodomor, or killing by enforced starvation. And whereas many of the 16,000 Minnesotans of Ukrainian heritage are the children or grandchildren of Holodomor survivors who made their way to Minnesota as displaced persons after World War II. And whereas on October 28, 2018, Minnesotans of Ukrainian descent, along with their friends and supporters, will gather to observe the 85th anniversary of this tragic event. And whereas we pay tribute to the strength, courage, and resilience of the people of Ukraine in Minnesota, where they contribute to the vibrancy of our state by starting businesses, building institutions, and sharing their rich cultural heritage. Now, therefore, I, Mark Dayton, Governor of Minnesota, do hereby proclaim Sunday, October 28, 2018, as Ukrainian Famine Memorial Day in the state of Minnesota. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the graced seal of the state of Minnesota to be affixed at the state capitol this 12th day of October. Mark Dayton, Governor. City of St. Paul, proclamation. Whereas 85 years ago, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his totalitarian regime committed an act of genocide by implementing an engineered famine, confiscating land, grain, and animals from the Ukrainian people, which led to the deaths of up to 10 million innocent men, women, and children. Whereas this genocide, known worldwide as the Holodomor, meaning murder by starvation, was intentionally designed by the Soviet regime to punish independent-minded Ukrainians for their resistance to its economic, political, and social oppression. And whereas, at the height of the Holodomor in 1933, Ukrainians died at the rate of 25,000 a day, with nearly a third of the victims being children less than 10 years old. And whereas, even as the Soviets continued to export Ukraine's grain abroad, Ukrainian farmers in the breadbasket of Europe were deliberately starved to a slow and painful death. And whereas, archival KGB documents detail the Soviet regime's actions and intention to destroy Ukraine's national identity by deporting and executing Ukraine's religious, intellectual, and cultural leaders, and any others who dared to mention the famine or speak against the Soviet authorities publicly. And whereas, under the global theme, Ukraine remembers, the world acknowledges, the Holodomor must be officially recognized by the world as a crime against humanity to prevent similar genocides from occurring in the future. Now, therefore, I, Melvin Carter, Mayor of the City of St. Paul, do hereby proclaim Sunday, October 28th, 2018, to the Ukrainian Genocide Remembrance Day in the City of St. Paul. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the City of St. Paul to be affixed this 28th day of October in the year 2018. Melvin Carter, Mayor. Дякую.
We are honored to have a few survivors of Holodomor in our community. Some of them were not able to attend due to health issues. If you are a survivor and you are in the audience, would you like to please stand up? Thank you. Pani Kira Stetsenko-Tsaragradski, a conductor of church and lay choirs, niece of composer Kirill Stetsenko, is a Holodomor survivor. She was not able to come in person, but was able to give us her message in video. Pani Kira has a story to share. For English-speaking audience, there is a translation in your programs.
Все, що я знаю зі слів своєї мами. Тато мій перед моїм народженням ще придбав щеня. Воно, очевидно, тоді виросло, і тато повів його до Дурова, щоб сказав, що він є. І Дуров сказав, це був доберман-пінчер. І Дуров сказав, що це вроджений сторож, і не чіпати. І так воно й було. І тоді вже, коли був голод, то того нашого вродженого сторожа, Гектора, його забрали до війська. Він був записаний до війська, його могли у нас забрати будь-коли, як сторожового пса. І, на щастя, його не забрали, бо він отримував харчі, так як будучи військовим, так сказати. І так, завдяки тому нашому собаці, ми врятувалися від того голоду. Крім того, що мама, звичайно, носила золоті речі в торксі в той час. Люди то робили, продавали на те, щоб виміняти на кусок хліба, на якусь поживу. Але в основному оцей собака, він нас врятував від голоду. Якби не він, то, мабуть, би пропали.
Thank you. Sofia Isai is the interviewer and researcher for the Children of Holodomor Survivor Speak Oral History project, the first project in North America to interview the second generation of Holodomor survivors that was initiated and conducted by the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center in Toronto. Sofia is also Assistant Director of Education of Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta, with the head office in Toronto. Due to the medical emergency, Sofia was not able to fly to Minneapolis to be with us in person, but we have set up a viral meeting and are happy to welcome Sofia and to hear about her findings on the transgenerational consequences of the Holodomor.
Hello, I'm Sofia Isayu. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your 85th commemoration of the Holodomor ceremony, and congratulations on your official Holodomor Memorial Day today. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person, but I am pleased to share this with you via technology. So let me start by asking you a few questions. What is significant about recording oral histories from children of Holodomor survivors in the diaspora? And what can be learned from even a small research project about them? What is transmitted from survivors to their children? How are they influenced by their knowledge, or their lack of knowledge, of their parents' trauma and survival? What is the legacy of the Holodomor on the next generation of survivors? And in what ways does it continue to affect them or their children? Recording, collecting, and studying the oral histories of survivors and their children is important because in them we find a perspective different from official recorded history, that of regular people who participated as eyewitnesses and actors. Oral histories are often called the first history because of this. It's that passing on of knowledge, memory, and experience by word of mouth, especially speaking in the language of family, the language of the body, in which the past breaks through in the forms of sighs and illness, tears and acute aches, the sounds of nightmares. These are the nonverbal acts of transfer that occur within family spaces. Oral histories are a great primary source of information that provides insight into the impact events had on those involved and describes a richer depth of experience people have gone through than any mere official record can. And they add a subjective dimension to it, a psychological dimension. Such stories can influence the second generation deeply, whether they are told or kept secret. Children of survivors, after all, inherit a horrific, unknown, and unknowable past that their parents were not meant to survive. And there is a psychological dimension. Oral history archives contain knowledge of our histories, and that knowledge shapes our identities as individuals, as a community, and our national identity. Oral histories matter because they are where groups speak for themselves, where voices without power gain audience. And certainly, in talking about the Holodomor, many children of survivors expressed how cathartic it was for them to be a voice for their survivor parent, because the Holodomor was ignored, covered up, and denied for over 5 decades. For too long, their parents could not tell their stories, and certainly not in public, and certainly not officially. Oral histories are a place where we can come to understand something more about ourselves and our past, and to figure out what kind of a future we want to work toward. They are an important guide for us as we evaluate that past. So what were some of the findings from my research project? Next slide, please. This oral history project was initiated and conducted by the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, we call it UCRDC, in Toronto, Canada, which is a nonprofit that collects information on historical and current events that concern Ukrainians in Canada, Ukraine, and throughout the world. So UCRDC occupies those 4 windows on the left you see there, on the 2nd floor of St. Vladimir Institute in downtown Toronto. And you can just see the sculpture of St. Vladimir there. Next slide. UCRDC compiles and stores archives, documents, photographs, audio and video testimonies. It records new interviews, produces documentary films, In fact, it produced the first film on the Holodomor called Harvest of Despair, which won many awards internationally. Maybe you've seen it. It publishes books, organizes lectures, exhibits, conferences, and book launches, designs and hosts school programs, supports scholarly research, and cooperates with research and archive centers across Canada and abroad. So this is a partial view of the offices, and some international visitors, one of whom you may recognize as Mustafa Jamilyev, the leader of the Crimean Tatars. Next slide, please. UCRDC's oral history collection has over 1,000 audio and video interviews collected over the past 30 years that are used by scholars, teachers, students, filmmakers, museums, and others. The research I'm sharing with you comes from an oral history project I worked on since 2015 entitled Children of Holodomor Survivors Speak, in which we interviewed 21 children of Holodomor survivors. It was envisioned by head archivist Irina Nitschka, and now, this year, the other organization that I work for, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, will be giving UCRDC monies to interview 10 more children of survivors in the new year, in 2019. So I want to give you an idea of what even a small oral history project starts to reveal about the Holodomor, or about the Holodomor's transgenerational consequences on the next generation of diaspora survivors. I like to colloquially call this the bad, the good, and the ugly of it. Our objectives in the project were to see if the knowledge of the parents' survival and experience of the Holodomor had a physical, emotional, social, or spiritual influence on their descendants. Also, to look at what the descendants' own life story is in all facets of their lives. Please go to our website, you see it there, ucrdc.org-COHS is the project, and you can look at individual pages on each of the interviewees, and you'll get the overview of the project. Next slide, please. So this is the first such oral history study addressing the legacy of the Holodomor on the lives of the second generation of survivors in the Canadian diaspora, but hopefully it sparks many more, and also especially in the US. We did not set any predetermined hypotheses for this study. The oral history method itself uses open-ended questions that allow people to freely express themselves and draw on memory as needed, because we wanted to see what sets of things would come up naturally. I consulted with a sociologist and psychologist to create the questionnaire, and, next slide, I did an analysis of these 5 out of the 51 questions we asked the respondents. I will show you what came up most frequently across all interviewees, so you see the range. But I have time to go into depth, more depth only on a couple of these. Next slide, please. 21 interviewees had 31 survivor parents between them, because some had both parents, some had only one. The parents' average age during the Holodomor was 11. So the youngest was 2, the oldest was 31. The interviewee's average age was 63, which means the youngest was 46, the oldest was 81. All had some form of Ukrainian schooling growing up as a common denominator between them. Next slide. Here are the children by profession. The 2 biggest categories they all grouped into were whether they had been told about the Holodomor as children growing up and it was talked about at home, or they had never been told about it. It was not talked about, and they figured it out or found out about it in various ways later on in life. Of those children whose survivor parent did not tell them or talk about the Holodomor as they were growing up, they described those parents as very smart and intelligent, but taciturn, guarded, almost untrusting, suspicious, timid, of few words, malomovny. Fathers tended to get more angry and irate over Ukraine when issues arose, even when it was the mother who was actually the survivor. For these families, with a parent living in fear, having to lie about where they came from, falsifying documents to get into Canada to avoid being sent back to be murdered by Stalin, it ate them up inside to be liars and to lie to their children about aspects of their history. When the children learned the truth later on, often in their teenage years, it caused rebellious behavior in them and inevitable feelings that everything the parent had told them were lies. The rest of this group was brought up hearing mostly stories of their parents' often quite prosperous lives pre-collectivization. It's almost like they came to a fresh start in Canada and did not want to weigh their children down with stories of hardships, so instead described their self-sufficient and idyllic earlier lives with land, livestock, bees, windmills, horses, pigs, fowl carriages, sable coats, velvet dresses, hired workers, and so on. They did this because they wanted to instill in them a strong connection to that earlier Ukraine that had existed before collectivization, that they remembered peacefully and not inflict their own wounds on their children. And as the children stated, to save their children the suffering. Significantly, especially for the parents who absolutely refused to talk about the Holod, they never called it the Holodomor, they called it the Holod, with their children, it was when their third generation grandchildren started asking them questions or wanted to interview them for their Ukrainian school projects, that for the first time then, already now in their 80s, they would open up, and their children, by now in their 50s, finally learned some details. So it was their grandchildren who became the catalyst for them to finally talk. So note, these are the children, and now, next slide please, their DNA goes all the way back to Ukraine. And these are the regions of Ukraine their parents came from. So of those whose survivor parents did talk about the Holodomor while the children were growing up, most children would hear the stories at the kitchen table, at celebrations, when others would come over, and people would ask, where were you in the 30s? And the anecdotal stories would come out. And the children absorbed them by osmosis in that environment. I cannot stress enough how growing up in this type of environment left almost an absolutely indelible impression on all of the children who absorbed it this way. And because they would then have to put the pieces together themselves like a puzzle, this led directly to their choosing professions as historians, clergymen, librarians, and educators, or in community organizations involved in different aspects of their social and professional lives. Also passed on to them was a profound, permeating sense of sadness and loss. In some cases, this led to an early adolescent rejection of Ukrainian things, which they later all seem to have more or less reconciled, in all cases but one. Or the opposite reaction was to carry on traditions, language, learning, and take on the mantle of ensuring a future independent Ukraine. Next slide, please. These are what can loosely be termed the bad stuff. The denial and cover-up of the Holodomor for so many decades was a rejection and denial of one's national and ethnic identity, which gave rise to the following challenges for the children. I'll talk here about the first two. The top one, that was universal across the board, was a deeply felt awareness of injustice. The survivors' children have a strong sense of social justice and deeply felt understanding of human rights, which influenced the careers they chose for themselves as criminal lawyers, educators, politicians, artists especially. Almost all have been or are activists in one form or another, and are active in various community organizations. In their own words, it even influenced the types of friendships they chose and the interests they pursued. So it deeply affected the social and professional, personal, and creative aspects of their lives. Loss of family. Most poignant of all, above everything else, was how they talked about what it means to grow up without relatives and what kinds of consequences that has in your life. Of fragmentation especially, not knowing one's roots, even one generation back. Of having no photos of what were once large families, no places to go back and visit. The villages no longer exist. Having no family traditions because of having no family and therefore feeling orphaned. They talked about there being survival guilt in their parent and this profound loss coming from the parent, especially at holiday times, which always created sad and uncomfortable holidays for the children each year. The result was they did not celebrate traditionally. Not knowing one's own genetics in terms of what might get passed on to a child you might want to bring into the world was another consequence. What diseases? No sense of any medical histories at all, which is a subtle legacy of the Holodomor, but a very real one for the children as they entered adulthood. All of this created residual anger and fear, in the children, and also regrets about not having relatives to go to for support or outside counsel when needed. When you couldn't go to mom and dad and there were no aunts or grandparents to support you instead. Realizing they as children of survivors have been victimized also. As one states, there's a sort of inner rage in me about how dare you have kept us away from each other. Next slide, please. These form the good, the silver lining, the lemonade that comes from surviving. That denial of identity and its survival also shaped certain positive markers of identity in the children that they recognized. I'll again talk about the first two more here. So the first was a sense of mission. Across the board from the parents, there is a passion for Ukraine that comes from a mission to be ambassadors of Ukraine, so as to ensure that Ukraine has friends in the rest of the world that will fight for it, so it can rebuild itself. That mission is passed down to the children. As one son said, "I took my father's words seriously." This is about keeping the traditions, customs, history, and language alive and working for the liberation of Ukraine. It includes Ukrainian school, Ukrainian dance, music, all forms of culture or scholarship. The second one was resilience. Resilience, and most especially, as they said, the quiet strength and indomitable spirit of women, was noted by almost all the children. A marker of resilience is belief in oneself and something larger than oneself. This is certainly true of the spirituality and faith that supported them. Another marker of resilience is that resilience develops out of the challenge to maintain self-esteem. A degree of resilience is indeed genetic. However, psychology experts still argue to what extent. But that example of resilience in the parents was honesty, hard work, a devotion to the country they left behind, but primarily always a hope that it would be free. And so that was really what they were trying to instill in us, is this hope, as one of the doctors said. Next slide, please. These map out what you could call the ugly, the not so pleasant issues that the children of survivors defined as community issues that need to be focused on, studied, discussed, and dealt with going forward. That is, recognition of PTSD in their parents, post-traumatic stress disorder, and in themselves, passed on from their parents. The divisive agent element within community organizations, often that came over with the diaspora, KGB agents or other, so on. The need for a truth and reconciliation process. This was above all expressed by all of them, that there is a very deep need for a truth and reconciliation process in Ukraine, but likely also in the diaspora. And finally, an awareness of the risk-taking inhibitions or risk avoidance in individual and organizational life that many of them felt kept us back often, or kept us back too long as a community. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to play you some of the videos of the children next, but I will leave you with this thought. First, I'll let you read that. From one of the survivor children. Oral histories about the legacy of the Holodomor's continued impact on the lives of the second-generation children of survivors not only teach us more about ourselves and provide invaluable historical, psychological, and sociological research for others, it is a reminder of our own moral responsibility to never forget the victims of the Holodomor. When we honor them, we honor all victims of injustice and cruelty. And when we teach about the Holodomor genocide in our schools, insisting on its inclusion alongside other genocides, we help to create responsible global citizens in the name of the survivors and their families, and dedicate ourselves to the protection of the human rights and dignity of all peoples. So here are the children of survivors in their own words. Could you play the video, please?
My mother was a survivor. That's at my mother's pochoron in June of this year. I, of course, had her eulogy, and I said, if anybody were to ask me to describe my mother with one word, it would be a survivor. It's all she knew how to do. In fact, dying was not easy. My mom passed away at home, in her own home, at the age of 90, with, of course, my help and the system I helped to create. They were there for her, palliative care at home, no hospital for her, absolutely. And 2 days before she passed, one of her personal support workers, who came to love her very much, started to cry. And she says, "Why are you crying? Why are you crying?" She says, "Oh," she says, "I don't want you to die." She says, "I'm not dying." Right up till the end. Not something we talked about. That it was ingrained. It was ingrained. And the Holodomor was responsible. Absolutely, absolutely. But that tenacity, I guess, is a characteristic that is shared amongst many Ukrainians, but I like to think that the tenacity that I've inherited from my mama and tata, you know, when I'm stubborn, it's perti hutzel, but otherwise it's horta poltavchanka. I think it's to my mother's quiet, yet determined stance in life that you had to do what you had to do in order to survive.
And since then, do you feel that the Holodomor has affected your life in any way?
Well, I wonder if I would have chosen criminal law and sort of social justice and have an interest in human rights had my parents not had this experience, had my parents not persevered during this horrible time. I mean, that's why I hear about what happened in Rwanda, for example, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I'm horrified by that. So I think it had developed, you know, my sense of social justice, my interests in my career, and I suppose even the types of friendships that I've chosen, type of interests I pursue.
When they talk to me about these things, I don't have any knowledge. I didn't have any knowledge. And all of that came to life only till 1990, when my little cyber dream of what the village looked like and the community lived in disappeared, and the real one came into place. And then everything started to come together. The names meant something. When I started writing down names, at first in 1990, the first little family tree, as I was heading into the airplane, trying to be able not to embarrass myself and not to know which cousins belong to whose parents, kind of thing. That was the beginning of it. And I realized that that is that part of your life, it's the best way to put it, that you've been victimized also. I think that's that reality that kicks in. Because if you can't connect to family, that means you're an orphan, right? So you act like an orphan. You have to basically go back to find those roots. If you can find one or two, you're lucky. So what I had was a source that knew more than one and two. When I finally got there, that just opened up the field, totally opened it up. And I found it very important that when Michael, in 2006, Michael was 12 years old, it was really important for me to get my parents and him there to bridge that connection. Because if not, then in this wonderful country of Canada, you will lose your kids. They will be yours, but they will belong to someone else. They will become strangers in your own life to some degree. You will have to be victimized a second time, to forget more, to fall to where your kids are going. So if your kids marry outside the community, then the genocide continues in most cases. It's a hard thing to tell some people, particularly to a son, less so to women, because our families are more matriarchal.
And it was interesting because, you know, every time there was something that was happening and the Soviets did something else or whatever, the first group of people to go on demonstrations were these people from this parish, and of course we kids went along as well. And how that influenced me, you know, I went to university at McGill. I studied history. And part of that is because I was fascinated, not fascinated, it was an emptiness. I couldn't put the pieces together as to what happened. My father always I felt his pain in a very indirect way. He would not talk about it. He was a very quiet and peaceful man who dealt with his trauma in a way of trying not to project it on others, but internalizing it. But I felt his pain. And when I used to ask him, I said, Tata, why don't you tell me about what happened to you? When I was only 7, 8 years old, he would say, to be in the traba, you don't need to know these things. You're just lucky that you never had to experience this, and I don't want you to experience it. But he used to speak to our adopted grandfather. We had the family that brought us over from Germany. They used to talk together, and they used to come to they'd come into the kitchen, they'd have a few drinks, they'd sit down, and they would discuss the past. And of course, I would sit in the corner and listen. Or I would sit under the table and listen as a kid. And they'd say, well, get lost, you don't need this. But I would come back. I needed to know. I felt this need, it was almost like a compulsion, I have to find out. And that led me to history. I loved history, it was my favorite subject at school. I excelled in it. When I graduated, I had one of the highest mark in the school in history, which I was pleased with. So when I went to university, it was a natural fit for me to study history. And so that's what I studied at McGill.
So that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Pani Sofia, for your wonderful speech, and we are pleased to have you as one of our key speakers tonight. Ukrainians are very talented in expressing themselves through poetry and songs during happy or sad times. A group of young people had prepared a medley of songs and poetry to honor the memory of those who survived through the Holodomor. I welcome to the stage Marika Voronchak, Gaля Voronchak, Oля Voronchak, Irina Ziborova, Natalia Predko, and Oля Predko.
Зорі за вікном.
те полум'я трить серця українців, що накрило собою величезну країну, квітучу, родючу і щедру. Помирали люди, молоді, здорові, яких можна було врятувати дуже просто. Голодним потрібно було лише дати хліба, та навіть не дати, а провернути.
В селі весна, повзе на ліптях, повзе по мертвих і живих. В долоні сонце ловлять діти і п'ють опухливими устами оту живицю молоду. Їм жить і жить, та над полями знов ворон каркає біду.
Села вимирали, опухлі від голоду люди падали мертві. Трупами були встелені дороги, двори, городи. Голодне лохіття найболючіше вразило дітей. Вони виявились найменш захищеними. Смертність дітей за деякими підрахунками сягала 50% загальної кількості померших. Діти значно швидше захоплювали внаслідок тривалого недоїдання і фізичного виснаження.
Забрали тих, хто із комори, пашню останню вимітав. Хто неактивний був учора, сьогодні ворогом ставав. Голодний рік, жорстокий світе, дай хоч надію для живих. Весна, і сонце ловлять діти, що дзвін оцкапує і стріх.
Неможливо зараз оцінити увесь масштаб тогочасної катастрофи. Складно нам, ситим, зрозуміти, як то немає ні крихти хліба, ні картоплини, а нічогісінько. Що робити бідної матері, коли на неї тижні, місяцями дивляться запалі очі голодних діточок? Нам, ситим, важко повірити, і таки багато хто й не вірить, що за велике щастя була перепічка з лободи. Ми сьогодні вимірюємо своє життя непомірними забаганками. Їздимо на курорти, купуємо автомобілі, гуляємо в ресторанах, їмо вдосталь, але не перестаємо зводити хулу на всі і все, бо таки звикли. Все нам складно. Але ж це як ні і що порівнювати. Комусь для щастя не вистачає чорної ікри, а комусь, як у ці далекі часи, мерзлої картоплі.
У той рік материну дитину клала в яму, копнувши під бік, без труни, загорнувши в ряднину, а на ранок помер чоловік. І трудягу старого без хреста понесли у той бік. І кістьми забілілі дороги за 100 земель сибірських, 100 рік. У той рік і гілля, і коріння все трощив навкруги буревій. І стоїть ще тепер Україна, як скорбота німа, край могил.
Люди добрі, пам'ятайте всіх поіменно і знайте, їх знищили за те, що вони народилися і виросли на нашій землі. А тому наш найсвятіший обов'язок сьогодні – зберегти пам'ять про всіх невинно закатованих під червоним прапором. Пам'ять про тих, хто не дожив, пам'ять про тих, хто недолюбив, пам'ять про живих і ненароджених. Ніхто не має права про це забути.
Достигали жити і тремтіли дитячі коліна. Косоокої смерті чорнів продіравлений плащ. Вимирало село, потопала в сльозах Україна, і розгублене небо ковтало задушений плач. Шаленів людомори, лютували, нові яничали. І старенька бабуся міняла ікону на хліб.
Над полями світини замучені душі ячали, і Дніпро захлипнувся у розпачі страчених слів. Хоче свіча, поминаючи нині молитви.
Розгудана пам'яттю малює історії світ.
Тільки ті колоски життєденні виміри
які завжди очима дитячими міряє світ. Голод 1932-33 років чорніє великою плямою на демографічній карті України. Втрат від цього ще не вдалося повернути ні матеріальних, ні тим більш людських. Говорячи словами Олександра Аніщенко, мертвим нікому довіритись, крім живих. І нам треба так жити тепер, щоб смерть наших людей була виправдана щасливою і вільною долею нашого народу. Мільйони людей, які загинули у 1932-33 роках голодною смертю, не можуть безслідно розчинитися у часі і просторі. Про них пам'ятаємо ми. Ми, хто вижив, їх діти та онуки. Пам'ять про Голодомор має бути вічною, як реквієм, як реперестора всім сущим на землі.
Ми його тіла крив.
I would like to welcome back Zina Polec-Gutmanis, who is going to speak about the oral history project we started in Twin Cities.
First, I'd like to briefly recognize the people who made today's program possible. First and foremost, keynote speaker Sophia Isaev, who was kind enough to give a presentation today, even though she has literally a life-threatening illness. Her groundbreaking work in Canada provided the inspiration for Our History, Our Stories. I'd also like to recognize the members of the Commemoration Committee, including all of the performers today. Ala Hristic, who is responsible for program logistics and coordination. Sasha Komarenko, who did the social media and also the very moving Light a Candle of Remembrance campaign videos that you can see in the exhibit room, and I encourage you to watch them. Lasa Lutzik for design and printing. Alex Politz, outreach. Taras Bidhaine, treasurer and event logistics. Paula Kamberg, outreach and decorating the hall, and then Zenon Davidovich, various. I'd also like to, of course, thank our priests and the many other volunteers who contributed today. Before we close with a moment of silence and prayer, I'd like to introduce the final video. I talked earlier about having a community conversation. That doesn't end today. I'm pleased to announce that the Ukrainian Center has received a grant from the Minnesota Historical Society to conduct a series of oral history interviews here on the topic of Minnesotans and the Holodomor. Stefan Ivaskevich, Alex Politz, and I will be volunteering on this project and will report back to you all when it's finished. This summer, we did our first oral history interview with Alla and Alexei Hristic. Stefan has put together this short video to give you a taste of what we're doing.
Алла Христич. Я народилася в місті Біла Церква Київської області.
Мене звати Олексій Христич, я також народився в Білій Церкві Київської області, Україна.
У моєї бабусі в сім'ї було 11 дітей, і з них тільки 5 вижили через Голодомор. Обоє з батьків померли. Батько взяв підводу, він пішов шукати хліб, шукати їжу, десь роботу. І ніколи не повернувся, ніхто його не бачив, тобто ніхто не знав, де він подівся. Прабабуся померла, і моїй бабусі було 15 років, коли це сталося. І вона пам'ятає, що була сама в холодній хаті і з мертвою мамою. Тобто було дуже важко, і вона не знала, що робити.
Мабуть, не розказувала, це треба було з неї випитувати, тому, на жаль, я нічого в неї майже нічого з інформації з неї не витягнув. Мабуть, було соромно питати або не хотілося. І сама, звичайно, бабуся цього не розповідала, тримала це в секреті. Ну, будучи, живучи в Радянському Союзі, такі речі, вона, певно, що в свій час, кому вона що скаже, коли всі це була загальнонаціональна біда, горе для всіх, і ти не прийдеш, не пожалієшся ні президенту, ні депутату, бо все було, то був комунізм, і я думаю, питання тут, відповідь є така, що просто не могли, куди до суду звертатися, до якого.
Я думаю, це її змінило дуже сильно. На те, як вона жила своє життя, як вона ставилась до життя, до людей. Вона була більш така закрита в собі. Я не думаю, що вона дуже сильно довіряла людям.
Як ви думаєте, що оце пережиття цього Голодомору зробило який вплив зробило на вашу рідню?
Для мене саме головне, я шаную їжу. Більш за все в своєму житті. Я не можу ніколи собі дозволити викинути їжу, тому що я пам'ятаю, як бабуся сиділа на кухні, і вона доїдала з кастрюлі, і після того, як кастрюлю всю вибрали картоплю бараболю, Вона ще сиділа і то вишкребувала до останньої до останньої краплинки тої їжі. І це з усім, з чим вона їла. І фактично я завжди своїх дітей вчу і свою родину, всіх своїх, і я дуже ставлюсь поважно до їжі.
Так. А в мене відбилось таким чином, що я не можу, щоб у мене їжі вдома не було. Якщо в мене полиці в холодильнику нормально заповнені, але трошки пусті більш-менш, в мене зразу паніка починається, вдома нема що їсти. І я повинна йти і зразу купувати, і в мене завжди є їжа. І в холодильнику, і консерви різні, крупи, тобто...
Please rise. Let's honor the memory of all the victims of Holodomor, as well as those who lived through the atrocity, with a moment of silence. Thank you. Today's commemoration event is going to be finished with a prayer for Ukraine, which is in your programs. Please join the community in the prayer. And the final word is thank you for coming. We invite you to visit the exhibit room and see the exhibit, the Wall of Remembrance, just in this Лисмикета room. Thank you again. Дякуємо всім за увагу.
That's the whole idea of Holodomor.
More than 100,000.